So the overnights on the burning bed were like spectacular.
They were unreal. And actually, between Burning Bed and Adam, which was another television movie that had a lot of social relevance, we had a dynamic package, Freeze Frame 1. The only problem we had is that we didn't have anybody to sell it. So I started working on a Monday, and it was Bob and myself, and we had somebody in research, kind of pro tem, and one sales guy. And Bob said, "Okay, well, I put them together. You go sell them." And so I said, "Well, what does that mean, really?" He said, "Well, you're going to take the top 25 markets, and you go sell the package." And that was my introduction to syndication. I started on Monday. Literally Wednesday, I was on a flight to Washington to go and pitch this package. And during the first 6 months, I think I sold something like 22 of the top 25 markets myself. So I was, every week, I was flying out and hitting either 2 or 3 markets a week, then flying back on Friday, and then on Monday turning around. And it was, in a lot of ways, it was a tremendous amount of fun. I mean, it's pretty hard work because you're doing that much traveling, but this was in 1985, and the whole syndication market was really starting to erupt. A lot of the local independent stations were signing on, and they needed product, and here we have a spectacular television movie product. And television movies were kind of a second-class citizen because, stations really wanted the James Bond movies or the studio movies. But if they couldn't get those, this particular package turned out to be a very good package. So we were selling it, and we were selling it for cash. And stations at that point had a lot of cash because they were all signing on, being financed by, excuse me, by banks, etc. And we did something. Actually, we set a record in the business. Freeze Frame 1 ended up having the highest grossing title highest grossing cost per title of any television movie that had ever been sold in syndication. Plus, we had 28 movies in the package, so it was also one of the highest grossing movie packages ever in syndication. Maybe even to this day, just because that form is no longer around. So then we followed up with Freeze Frame 2, and as I was going along, after the first 6 months, then we started adding staff. So I was able to hire somebody in New York and somebody in Atlanta, somebody in LA, so I wasn't doing all of the traveling myself. And then got into more of a management role, your traditional sales management. And then I guess we did that for about 2 years. Also started getting into First Run, which was really very interesting. First Run, to me, is probably one of the most dynamic types of programming in the business because you don't have number one, you really don't have any budgets to speak of. It's certainly working for a company like Freeze or Goldwyn or even Tribune compared to the studios. Very little market research. You make a pilot, then you go sell it, and you go market to market to market. Give presentations to every station in the market, and if you get enough critical mass, then you go out and produce it. So it was really a extremely dynamic because you're in a lot of ways you're flying by the seat of your pants. You had to have pretty good instincts in terms of, number one, what you could sell, and number two, what could be produced. And number three, it had to be produced for the budget. So that was my introduction to First Run syndication. And it was great because it was wide open. I mean, stations in those days needed programming. They were willing to take a chance, which was important because now they're on enough time periods So it's very difficult to launch shows, especially for an independent, because you're up against all of the studios with all of their resources. But in those days, stations were willing to give a program a shot because they didn't know any more than you did. So if you say, hey, I got this great idea for a show, and you'd pitch them the show, they say, you know what, that's a pretty good idea. Let's give it a shot. Because if it didn't work, they could cancel it. So they were taking some risk, but not excessive, and it wasn't for millions of dollars. The distributor was doing the same thing. He was trying, in a lot of cases, you would either shoot a pilot, or some cases you just shoot basically a sizzle reel, where you'd put together 3 or 4 minutes of what you think the show is going to look like, without even making the show. You'd go sell the sizzle reel, and when you had 80% of the country sold, then you'd go see if you could make what the sizzle reel said you were going to do. So it was, it was quite a learning experience, and it was a lot of fun, just because there was so much going on in the industry at the time.
So when you first started at Freeze, you reported directly to Chuck Freeze, I assume. Is that
No.
at the early days, or no?
No, when I first started, I reported to Bob Lloyd, who was president of distribution, and Bob reported to Chuck Freeze.
So after you made your 25-city tour as your first kind of foray at this company, at some point you got a promotion, correct, to
Yes.
Senior VP? And is that sort of at the same time you're adding staff that then you were supervising?
Well, I became vice president of domestic sales, added staff at that point, and then after we were doing well in sales, I asked for more responsibility because I wanted to get into the programming side. So I started when I was, even in sales, I was getting involved in acquiring product, because Chuck didn't have enough films that he could produce himself, so we had to go out and find other places to acquire. One of the things that Bob Lloyd worked on was acquiring the Columbia library from Columbia Studios. I worked on a couple of acquisitions. One of them was acquiring the library from ABC, because ABC in those days was actually producing television movies. So I found this package and we negotiated a deal. I don't think we took all of the titles that were available, but we did maybe 20 titles. So I liked the idea of getting involved and not just selling the programming, but having a voice in what we were going to be selling. So first I got involved in acquisitions, and then as the business started doing more and more first-run development, I wanted to get involved in development, because I figured if I could figure out what I could sell, it would be a lot easier than having somebody else figure out an idea that they think would, and give it to me, and then I'd have to go sell it. And if it wasn't saleable, we've just wasted a lot of time. So it made sense, and still does today, to have somebody with boots on the ground, with the, who understands how sales works in the development process. So I became Senior VP of distribution for Chuck, which involved acquisitions, development, and sales as well.
What would you look for as a buyer? What was selling at that time? Or what did you see as the kind of projects that would sell?
Well, in those days, it was, some of it was a function of how much you could afford to produce. And with Chuck, we had pretty limited budget, so there were certain things that we were not able to do. Like, what was selling very well in those days were talk shows. But talk shows were big risk, big reward, even in those days, with a lot of resources. So we knew we couldn't do that. And Chuck also wanted to just kind of stick his toe in, because he was a very, very good producer, but he was basically minting money from these cash movie packages, because they were, first of all, he had some debt to service, so he had to get the cash to pay for the acquisitions. And it was a nice business, because you'd go out and you literally would come back with an order for $4 million starting in 3 months. That's that's a great business. So to risk anything at that point with a company that was just getting started was something that Chuck didn't want to do. So we started on a very small level. I remember we did one project on a it was kind of an auto critique show, critique on cars. I forget the name of it, which was a terrible idea because we shot this pilot and we went to pitch it to television stations, and naturally, if you're critiquing cars, there's going to be some good features and some bad features. And the two hosts who were local LA personalities, very knowledgeable, but they didn't pull any punches. And I remember putting on the tape in full of a room full of salespeople, and the guy came on and said, "Well, this Ford will never work because it's really just a piece of junk." And one of the salespeople or sales managers from one of the television stations in Nashville or whatever jumped up and he said, we could never run this. I'd lose all my local business. So it was that point I said, you know what, I got to protect myself here. I have to get more involved in the development side of it. So we did check. The one project, first run project, we did a couple of them, small. One of the things we did was Howdy Doody's 40th anniversary. If you remember Howdy Doody, it was a character to a lot of us growing up in the 50s. Somehow, we found out that Howdy Doody was turning 40 years old, and we did a 2-hour special on it, and I went out and pitched it to David Simon, who's a very good programmer, ended up in Disney. Also was at the Television Academy as a governor for the producers group peer group for a couple of years.
And this is with Buffalo Bob involved?
Yeah, Buffalo Bob was involved. I went over to David. David Simon was VP of programming for the Fox station group. And I pitched him the idea, just like I'm pitching you, nothing other than we have this idea, and we're going to show some vintage footage, and Buffalo Bob's going to come back, and we sold it. And it went on the air and did very well. And the other show that we did was something called Born Famous. And that was a series of 6 or 8 one-hour specials. It was hosted by Meredith McRae. And it was a look into TV personalities who were born as sons of famous personalities. Like Meredith McRae, who was the host, was the daughter of Gordon McRae, who was a big-time singer in the 40s and 50s, an actor or two, I guess. So that was the scope of what Chuck was comfortable doing in those days. And it was really the cash movie packages that was driving the company.
What was cable doing around that time, just to kind of keep up with it?
That's a good question. My general recollection is cable at this point is getting distribution in the 80s and starting to, but more for retransmission of existing signals than original programming. So it was, some of the cable networks were starting to come online, not so much when I was at Freeze, but when I went to Goldwyn, which was in 1987, because I remember having meetings then with guys like Josh Sapan in 1987, 89, somewhere during then, when he was just launching AMC, and Brad Siegel, who was just at Disney Channel. So it was really, in 87, I think all the ingredients were there, and they were starting to percolate. They were starting to realize that they needed product, a lot of library product, but also perhaps some original product as well, or product that had been repurposed product.
So you made the move to Samuel Goldwyn Television. What precipitated that? You were at Freeze for a couple of years, maybe?
Yeah, I was at Freeze for about 2.5 years. Bob Lloyd had left, and Chuck decided that he wanted to bring somebody with a New York presence in, so he brought back Ave Butensky from New York to L.A. as president of distribution, and I would report to, as senior VP, I would report to Ave. Ave, if you remember, was the gentleman that I went to see when he was Dancer Fitzgerald Sample, who actually got me into the business. So there was no friction there. It was just that I was a little frustrated because I had, kind of hit a glass ceiling. And at the time, Sam Goldwyn had decided that he wanted to expand his television operation. So there was a gentleman by the name of Mike Bird who was put in charge of the job search. They didn't have a search firm. He just made calls, and somehow somebody gave Mike my name, and I met with him, and his specialty was international. He's a really great guy, very knowledgeable, probably one of the nicest guys I've ever worked with in the business. And I interviewed, and about 3 months after Ave came on, actually I give Chuck a lot of credit. Chuck let me out of my contract to go work for Sam Goldwyn, and I went to say goodbye to him, and I said, well, I just want to thank you for letting me out of your credit. He said, you know what, they need you over there. You did a great job for me. Why not? The world's too small, and good luck, Mazel Tov. And I took off. And I still see Chuck to this day. He's still on the Academy Foundation board, and he's still around. Quite a personality in his own right. So I went to work for Samuel Goldwyn Television as president, and it was really a turnaround operation. I didn't know that much about it. I mean, I knew some of their product. They had a great library of classic titles and features that Sam Goldwyn Sr. had produced in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they had acquired some great titles as well. So they had good classic library, movies, which I enjoyed selling. They hadn't done anything in first run, and they wanted to get into that area. And that was an area that I wanted to also make my mark in. So I started at Samuel Goldwyn in April of '87, and I'll never forget my first day. Because I started, I showed up on a Monday, and I put on a shirt and tie, and nobody else had ties on, so lost that the second day. But I walked in, they showed me my office, and this is your office, and I said, this is fine, this is nice. And we had a couple meetings, and I got 2 phone calls that day. The first was, I got a heads up from, I forget who it was who called me, but somebody in New York, and said, I just want you to know, Milt Grant just went bankrupt. Now, Milt Grant, for all of the distributors, was, he was the fountainhead. He was spending money like crazy, buying everything, and in a lot of cases overpaying, because he had to overpay to kind of buy his way into the markets. And he was in markets like Philadelphia, Chicago, Miami, Atlanta, I think, a couple other major markets, and we had all kind of backed up our truck, sold them product at outrageous pricing, and everybody was happy until he declared bankruptcy. So I got heads up the first day that he had gone bankrupt. So first thing I did, I think before noon, is call to introduce myself to the CFO and say, just for the heck of it, how much receivables do you have from Milt Grant? So he came back and said, we got a couple million. I said, that's great. It's not even noon yet, and we're down a couple of $1 million on Milt Grant. And then later that afternoon, I got a call from Mark Gitkin. Mark Gitkin in those days was a young agent at William Morris. He's now on the board of WME, and he's probably one of the most, if not the senior guy in first-run syndication and cable and now non-scripted television in the business. And he said, there's a project over at your place that has been sitting there 2 months, and I have interest from another company, and I want to take it to them, but as a courtesy, I just wanted to tell you that. And I said, what's the name of the project? And he says, it's a project called American Gladiators. I said, well, look, today's my first day. I've heard a bit about it because I had some briefing before I even started that, just to find out what I was walking into. I said, well, give me 48 hours so I can find out about it. I'll give you an answer. Is that okay? And Mark said, sure, 48 hours is okay. So I hung up the phone and said, okay, now somebody come up and tell me what this Project American Gladiators is. So I don't think we even had a development person. So the head of sales, a guy named Jack Masters, came up and he said, here it is. It was like a 4-page brochure on American Gladiators. And I looked through the brochure, and it was just pictures, no words, or if there were words, and one of the pictures was 2 guys in a round ring with a rope attached to around their waist. So I said, what's this? And he said, that's one of the events. I said, what's the event? He said, the event is one guy has to pull the other guy out of the circle. I said, so that's a television show? He said, well, that's, so I called the producer. I said, give me the pitch, because I got to make a decision on this pretty quick. So he pitched it. It was an interesting concept, extremely rough, but it was developed by a guy named Johnny Ferraro. Johnny Ferraro, this is a true story, was an Elvis impersonator in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And he had staged, with his own money, that round circle. And he had called it American Gladiators. I think he had 2 or 3 other events, and he had come to L.A. trying to find a producer, and he ran to a producer called Ron Askin, who was a legitimate producer, very prolific. And Ron had optioned the name from him and the basic concept, but hadn't done too much with it. So I really wasn't sure what to do. So I said to the people at Goldman, I said, okay, what else do you have in development? And they said, that's it. So I called Mark and I said, we want to option this, we want to develop it. And we did. It took us a year, because the only thing I really liked about it, I liked the idea of the mano a mano, and I loved the title, American Gladiators. I didn't really know what it meant, but it sounded pretty cool. And there had been a show called Battle of the Network Superstars back in the mid-'80s that had been on ABC during the summer, and I used to like watching it. So over the course of a year, we paid for development, and we developed American Gladiators on kind of the general principles of Battle of the Network Superstars meets showbiz. So we want to kind of glam it up a little. But we decided that it had to be legitimate. We didn't want to go the WWF route. We wanted to make it lots of sizzle, and we did a pilot. And actually, it was in those days. I think the Goldwyn television department, myself included, were about 9 people, and 3 of them were sales guys who were never around. One was research and one was finance. So there were like 2 of us who were kind of working on it from Goldwyn. And hired a guy named Ray Solly, who was VP of Development for the CBS O&Os, and he became my Director of Development, or VP of Development. And he and I worked with Ron Askin and his people developing American Gladiators. And we shot a pilot up in Griffith Park in the Equestrian Center. And the pilot, we wanted to look sexy, so we shot it at night so we could light it and all that type of thing. And it was supposed to start at 7 and end at 11:30 at night. Well, end at 11. It was a 4-hour shoot. And we had been involved in everything. We had actually auditioned the gladiators and helped them identify the games. So we shot this pilot. Started at 7, supposed to be out at 11. Fran Tarkington was the host. We walked out the following morning at 6:30, and it was obvious that we had no clue on what the show is, what we were doing, what the event. I mean, we knew nothing. And in fact, one of the people said, "We have to hurry up because we have to beat the light because it was, the sun was coming up." But from that fiasco of a pilot shoot, we figured out what the show was, and we had done a pilot, and we were. There were two projects in the market at that time: American Gladiators and Rollerball. And Rollerball was based on the movie, and it was selling like crazy. American Gladiators, it's like Death of a Thousand Cuts. We went market to market to market, and we finally got it on the air. But we found that because we had done a pilot, when we finally started producing it, we knew what we were doing. And we hired Larry Zonka and, I forget the other host. Mike Adamle was one of the hosts, and American Gladiators became a phenomenon. It became a glitzy show. It was on the air 7 years. We were the #1 non-scripted show. We didn't call it non-scripted, and we just called it reality or not scripted.
Was Joe Theismann an early host too, or was that?
I'm sorry?
Was Joe Theismann one of the hosts?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
It was Joe Theismann, Mike Adamle, and actually Mike wasn't originally one of the hosts. It was Joe Theismann and Larry Zonka.
Okay.
And they did it for 2 seasons, and we brought Mike Adamle in to do the play-by-play, and he was great. And it was on the air for 6 years. It grossed a lot of money. It wasn't. Once we learned how to do it, it wasn't a very expensive show to produce because we would gang shoot. We would shoot the entire season in 2 weeks, and then spend a lot of time in post putting it together. Very similar to what they do right now with Survivor, et cetera. This was in 1991, I think, as the first season went on. And it was a learning experience for all of us, and it was probably the most fun project I've ever been involved in because we were literally out going to parks, having guys doing pull-ups and push-ups to see if they were going to be contenders or going to be gladiators. And as this started rolling, we'd fly into New York and have the tryouts for the contestants at the Coliseum in New York, and they would have 3,000 and 4,000 people showing up. So it was also quite a management. One of the New York sales guy, Gary Perchik, he ended up calling me, and he said he was at the Coliseum. He said there was almost a riot. There were so many people wanting to try out for the first season of American Gladiators that they had to call in police to just help you manage all the crowd. So we knew that we had something that had captured the imagination of the weekend jock, and we exploited it to the best of our ability for a long time.
After the original pilot was shot, did you have to tweak it, or did you just make it work once you had it in the can?
No, we threw out the original pilot. I mean, it was totally. It was so bad that what we did to sell it, because we had this pilot that had run a half hour, but we had a Velcro event where a guy would have a Velcro suit on, and he would go up and stick on a wall, and the higher you went up, the more points you got.
Sounds like Letterman.
We had problems with it because for like 2 hours of the pilot shoot, he wouldn't stay, so he kept on sliding down, and then for the next 2 hours, he would stick on, and we couldn't get him off without ripping the costume. So this is while we had 100 people around paying for this pilot, because the pilot cost $200,000 to shoot.
But you said the buzz was around Rollerball was another show, a competing show. But what did it take to? Did you have to really make a good deal to get it on, and then it went crazy right off the?
Well, you know what happened? It was really interesting. Rollerball, all they did is they had a big sheet. Mort Marcus, who was probably one of the smartest and best salespeople in the business, was selling Rollerball. And he just had a big figure-8 track, very similar to roller derby, where the contestants would jump over alligator pits and that type of thing. And we had actually tape on it. But he had gotten to the Tribune Group, and the Tribune Group signed on right away, basically bought the pitch based on the card, because, again, Mort's a great salesperson, still is. And we had to go market to market and basically take the second and third station in the market, if we could get something at all. So we did it the most difficult way you possibly could. Plus, we also had to defend. I mean, it's kind of an outrageous concept to begin with. I mean, American Gladiators, what is it? Well, it's unlike anything you've ever seen. But we had cut the tape down to 2 minutes, so it was really pretty exciting. Visually, it was unlike anything on the air. And a lot of stations took a flyer. I mean, they would do that in those days. And I remember walking in to see a woman named Karen Cohen, who is the program director of WNBC in New York. And I put on the tape, and she said, "You've got a hit." And I said, "Oh, God." And I said, "Would you have a time period?" She said, "No, but you got a hit anyway. Good luck with it." She eventually gave us 2 o'clock in the morning on WNBC after whatever show ran after Saturday Night Live. I think it was Showtime at the Apollo. So we started 2 o'clock in the morning there, a really weak station in Chicago, I think KHJ in LA. So we just had a kind of a patched together lineup of people who had really nothing, either had free time periods. Some of, we had a couple good time periods, but basically we were the second guy in. But when we went on the air, because we had shot the pilot, we learned how to essentially produce the show. Rollerball hadn't shot a pilot, so they went on the air, and they ended up going through Rollerball what we did in the pilot. Their first 5 shows were awful and continued to get worse, and our shows were pretty good, and they started getting better. So we went on the air. I forget what the rating was. I think it was maybe a 2 rating, which was not very good. Then we notched up to a 2.3 and then a 2.5. And then toward the end of the first year, we were actually over-delivering the number that we had promised the advertisers, which was a source of frustration because you're basically leaving money on the table. Because advertisers, you have to guarantee them the rating. And if you under-deliver, you have to give them more spots. But if you over-deliver, they say thank you very much, and they don't give you anything more. So we probably left a couple $100,000 because we over-delivered, because nobody thought it was going to be as successful as it was for a season. And Rollerball was canceled after 13 weeks.
As the ratings increased, did the local stations upgrade to better time, time slots?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's really what syndication is. I mean, somebody once said to me that syndication is like a stained glass window. And you have all of these little pieces, different colors, and you start off in some chaotic pattern, and hopefully, if it works, toward the end, you have a picture, let's say, a beautiful lineup. And that's what syndication salespeople do. Their job was to get it on the best station they could, and then as it improved, they improved the time period, got more promotion money, and all of those things that made the national number grow. So the process of American Gladiators was actually for the first 5 years, or maybe first 4.5, every year it increased. Some of it was a function of the production being better and just being a better show, and we were getting better contestants. But a lot of it was really just marketing driven. We were getting more publicity. The stations were giving us better time periods. They were promoting it. We were getting a lot of national breaks. President Bush, H.W. Bush, actually mentioned American Gladiators in one of his State of the Union speeches. So we sent him a note, and amazingly, and with a hat and a shirt, and thank you very much, etc. And he sent back a very, very gracious thank you on White House stationery, which I still have framed. And then one of the other breakthrough pieces of publicity was Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton said in a TV Guide article, he was asked, what does he do with Chelsea for hobbies, for their free time? And he said, one of the favorite things we do is we get together every Saturday morning in Washington and we watch American Gladiators. I love that show. And as soon as you hear something like that, you break it everywhere you can. And about 2 years ago, actually, I had the privilege of meeting President Clinton, and I said, we don't have. You're not sure what you're going to say to the president. So I said, I just want you to know, Mr. President, that we have something in common. And he said, well, what's that? And he said, well, I created. I was involved in the creation of American Gladiators. I didn't create it. And he said, I love that show. Chelsea and I used to sit there and watch it, and Hillary would come in and she'd say, why are you watching that show? That show is dumb. And I'd say, Hillary, this is American pop culture. This is where it's all at. So he told me that story. We had a picture taken, and that was my brush with the president. But it was organic marketing like that really drove American Gladiators, and it ended up being it was on the air 7 years, a huge financial success.
Great impression, by the way.
Oh, well, I don't know. We'll see.
At what point would you say it was a bona fide hit? Was it near the end of the first season, the beginning of the second season?
Well, first season, it wasn't a hit. It was improving, and it was encouraging. And somewhere, I'd say somewhere in the second season, we knew that we started making plans for season 2, 3, and 4 in the second season. So we knew that we had something that was working pretty well. And if we didn't screw it up and we kept on reinvesting money in the production and the marketing and inventing new games and upgrading, that we could really ride it pretty well. But I think it really came home to me, and this is one of the things I love about television, because, I basically had bought a title, and we optioned a title. I think we paid $10,000 to option it and also develop it. And about 2.5 or 3 years later, we were in the middle of one of our production cycles. It was produced over at, it's now CBS Radford. It was the MTM studios then. And I walked into the set, which was huge. It was, a stadium. So it wasn't. And there were a couple hundred people screaming and yelling with signs for Nitro and their favorite gladiator, and there were probably about 100 people on the set doing various functions, and you realize that it's kind of the miracle of television that from that one, those 2 words, American Gladiators, it became something that captured so many people's imagination and took on a life of its own. And it was just, and created all those jobs and changed so many people's lives, or at least livelihoods. So it's pretty remarkable, and that's the thing that I think is just fascinating about television.
How would you say American Gladiators changed the face of television, and how did you contribute to that?
Well, I think it'd be presumptuous to say it changed the face of television. I mean, it was a very successful project. But I think what it was, it was a different type of television, and in a lot of ways it was the legitimate predecessor of all of the reality competition shows that you see on the air today. I mean, if you look at Dancing with the Stars, the lighting and the set is very similar to the style of American Gladiators. So I think that whole arena type of thing, plus the fact that we got a lot of pressure early on to change the concept of gladiators and go the WWF routine of making it scripted. And we decided if we were going to have these athletes that were actually going to go out there and sweat and train, and that we wanted to keep it legitimate, and we did. I mean, we never tried to influence the outcome one way or the other. And I think that's the thing that turned out to be consistent with today's reality competition shows. And it really is in the reality competition genre. It really isn't in the non-scripted genre like the Housewives, et cetera, because there's no comparison. But, you know, so I think that's why it was a predecessor. It wasn't, you know, we had some of our legacy from the Battle of the Network Stars. I think some of the shows today either directly or indirectly use the techniques and the camera moves and the scoring and the essential rules of legitimacy for American Gladiators. I don't know if it changed the face of television. It was just a television project, and all television projects, to one degree or another, have their own finite beginning, middle, and end.
The original concept, or the concept as it aired, the Nitros and the various sort of regulars, the gladiators, they would be opposed. They would compete with like civilians, right? People
Yes.
who were trained and come on. Did that evolve, or did that concept stay throughout the entire run of the series?
No. That, to me, that was one of the most important features of Gladiators. It really was everyman. And the thing I liked about it when we were talking about developing it is that if you're a weekend jock and you play tennis, you lift weights, you run marathons, whatever it is, it was a legitimate possibility for you to go out as an average man, go through the tryouts, and get on television to compete against these superheroes. And they were very good athletes. Several of the athletes had played pro football, Dan Clark, for example. But they were all good athletes, and the competition was legitimate. And we tried to create events that really minimized and the size advantage that the gladiators had. So we tried to get in events that actually gave the guy who is, let's say, 5'8" and 170 pounds an equal chance to either meet or beat the gladiator in some events. And a lot of, like there was a lot of upper body strength required in some of the events. And the gladiators, who were anywhere from, let's say, 190 to 220, they weren't nearly as good as some of the contestants. So that was, that's the thing I really liked about the show. It was the everyman, that if you're good at what you're doing and you're lucky and you have an interesting story, because we did want to have the most interesting types of contestants, because we wanted them to be able to tell their story. And some of them were vets who had just come back from the Middle East and told their story. And, it was that humanity coupled with the legitimate competition that we felt from day one really drove the show. And as it turns out, we were right. Because when I first sold, when I was first trying to sell American Gladiators, I went in and pitched it to the head of Fox Station Group, not Fox Network. But he had the power to say yes and no for the whole group. And he said, I will give you an on-air order right now for the entire first season, double runs, which is like the golden grail of syndication, but you got to make it scripted. And, I said, we can't, because that's not what this show is. He said, but WWF is doing great. I said, but that's not what, we are. So we ended up having to turn down that order and go the market by market by market. But it was, it was something that we believed in, and it was, so important to the integrity of the show in terms of what it needed to be to have all those touchstones that we talked about, that we really, it would have been a mistake I think we would probably have shot ourselves in the foot, because we would have gone on the air with a different show, and all of a sudden we'd be writing corny dialogue for the contestants to say or the gladiators to say, and I don't think it would have had the life that it did.
Let's talk about some of the other shows you were involved with at Goldwyn.
Okay.
And some of these we can do sort of like a word association, if you like, just say a few comments about. But let's go right to Gladiators 2000. What was the concept, and how was it connected to American Gladiators?
Well, Gladiators 2000, we had the sets, and this was about the second or third season, and the sets had actually grown massive. And Eitan Keller, who is a very prolific producer who's doing Iron Chef right now, he came up with the idea of being able to fly in these huge 2 and 3 ton sets, up and down on wiring. So we said, well, if we have that type of flexibility, what else can we do with the sets? So we knew that the broadcast stations have an obligation to broadcast, it's called EI, Entertainment and Information Kids Programming. So we knew we had the sets, we had the gladiators, so we didn't have very much out of pocket, so we said, why don't we do a kids gladiators? Because we had we didn't care about the kids from an audience perspective, because we were really after the teens and the 18 to 49 men. Those were our target audiences. Eventually it became the women as well. But the kids were they were there, they were the biggest fans, but they were kind of underutilized. So we did Gladiators 2000, which was a kids version where we'd have kids contestants run up, and when they got to the top of one event, in addition to doing the physical, we would ask them some question according to a predetermined curricula of educational questions that we had. And we had that on for 2 years. It did pretty well. I think the most notable thing about that show is the host. We had one host who was a 16-year-old girl, I forget her name, and she was pretty good. And we had another guy who was, I'd say 19 or so, because he did more of the play-by-play, who was I think it was his first job in television. He had been on the radio in Philadelphia, and he was okay. For a while, we thought the girl was actually a little better, because she relayed to the audience. But her co-host was a guy named Ryan Seacrest. And that was his first gig in L.A., as far as I know. In fact, I've seen him quite a few times since then. He always references the move to L.A. for Gladiators 2000. And obviously he got much better very quickly. And actually we did the Emmys. He was the host of the Emmys when I was chairman in 2007.
Oh, yes.
And we kind of... And along the ways, he had also pitched me various projects when he was kind of coming up through the ranks. But he was the talent from day one, and after the first couple of shows, he really got it down, and you could see him growing week after week on camera. So that was that was our claim to fame of Gladiators 2000. It was Ryan Seacrest's launch pad. And
he hosted the Emmys solo too, if I recall.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Not
and did a very good job.
I think I thought so too. Just briefly, GamePro TV. What was that?
GamePro was a half-hour kid show, and it was based on GamePro magazine, which was a magazine that was dedicated to gaming, which really now has become a huge industry. And this was the first and probably the best of the gaming magazines. And if you watch the show, you would learn some of the secret tricks of, let's say, Zelda or the Mario Brothers. If you if you go through the wall and hit the button 3 times and flip it around twice, all of a sudden you skip to another world. It was that type of thing. And that was on the air for, I think, 1 or 2 seasons. The host of that show is a gentleman by the name of J.D. Roth, who has gone on to have a great career in non-scripted entertainment. As a matter of fact, I think he did The Biggest Loser, and he's also doing something that just premiered 2 weeks ago. I think it's called The Great Dive or The Big Dive, which I'm not sure is how...
It's not Splash, is it?
Splash, I'm sorry. That's
As
exactly
a producer, he's doing it.
He is, yeah, that's right.
He was a host back in the
executive
early days, right?
He was the host of GamePro, but now he's behind the scenes, and he's had a lot of big non-scripted hits. And we'll see how Splash does. Actually, I watched it, and it was well done. It had a lot of the elements of American Gladiators in terms of the staging and the suspense and the lighting, etc.
Well, I was thinking about that when you were talking about Gladiators. That lighting pattern I've seen in so many shows. Everything from like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire with the dramatic lighting to like you mentioned, Dancing with the Stars. Splash has the same kind of thing. This sort of nighttime dramatic lights.
That's what it was.
Automatic lights. Turning and panning,
and you have to credit I can't remember who did the original lighting on the show, but you have to credit him because he gave, I think he gave the genre the look. And in fact, I wish I had researched that before this interview so I could give him a shout out.
And I think the advent of these robotic light instruments has really helped in terms of, they can all move in synchronous motion as opposed to being operated separately. So Goldwyn, you brought back Flipper for a few years. What motivated that? And how was that? Was that a remake, or what was Flipper?
Yeah, actually, Flipper was part of the Goldwyn Library. They had, I think it was 58 half hours that was shot in black and white in the 80s. And we sold it along with our other library titles. I think we had the movies, and then we had some series. And at that time, when I was at Goldwyn, the idea of international co-productions were just starting to get some traction, where you would finance part of the project in the U.S., and then you would go to MIP or MIPCOM, the markets that you have in the south of France, and find international partners to help you basically produce the rest of the show. So we had Flipper in our library, and Sam Goldwyn always wanted to do a remake of it. And this was something that was worth a shot, because you knew that there was a market if you could do it right. And what my role in it was actually, it was a little, sometimes it was difficult, because I had to tell Sam what the project had to be creatively so I could sell it. So it's almost regardless of what you want to do, this is what it's got to be if it's going to get on the air. So originally, he wanted to do it as a half hour, because that's what the original was, and for story purposes. And we got into a lot of very heated conversations, because I said, I can't sell a half hour in the market. He said, well, you're good. You can sell anything. I said, no, I can't, because there's nothing to pair it with. It has to be an hour. And that drove him nuts, because everything doubled. The cost of production doubled, and everything, cost of marketing. And then I said, and it can't be a kid's show. And he said, well, Flipper. I said, it can't be a kid's show, because if it's going to be an hour, it's going to be in time periods that adults are going to watch. Kids won't. There may be kids there, but we don't care about kids, because you can't get enough money from the barter sales by appealing to kids. So, so it was really kind of a classic case where creative meets the business realities, and it was kind of a back and forth. Because it probably could have been a good half-hour show, but it never would have gotten on the air because nobody could have afforded it. So we ended up doing it as an hour, and we made it family-friendly, so it had some kid appeal, but really we were going for the 18 to 49. I mean, that's really the way we designed the show, and that's the way we designed the storylines. And we went out, and the first 3 episodes, we sold it. We sold it very well, except for New York. We had a problem in New York, so we finally ended up getting it on the air in New York. And we shot the first 3 episodes in one of the Florida Keys. And there was a 40-ish lead whose name I can't remember, and his young daughter who was about 14, 15, who was Jessica Alba, who went on to do a couple significant things in town and still is. And after the first 3 episodes, we realized that the company would probably go bankrupt if we didn't make a radical change, because the cost of production, shooting it on water in the U.S., for all the other reasons, all those attendant reasons in those days, just was cost prohibitive. I mean, we would have bankrupted the company. So we found a foreign partner called Village Roadshow, and we moved the production to Australia. And we ended up shooting 2 seasons. It did okay. It wasn't great, but it did okay. I moved over in '96, I moved over to Tribune as CEO of Tribune. With Goldwyn's permission, I took that project with me, Tribune got involved, and we made 3 more seasons. It was either 2 or 3 more seasons. So we ended up having a 5-season run on Flipper, 110 episodes, and then we sold the back end, which made everybody, make a lot of money, or at least recoup. I mean, I'm not sure how anybody ever makes a lot of money in Hollywood sometimes, but everybody came out pretty well, and the series was considered to be It was great because it was a template for other things to come, and it showed us how to set up these international co-productions, how to do them, what to avoid, how to mount them, the stories you have to tell, and probably as importantly as anything is how to bring in the foreign money. Because the more foreign money you could bring into a project, the better it was for your own sake.
Was it a remake, or was it was it the same Flipper? I mean, was it connected to the old show?
Well, yes. I mean, the concept was definitely the old show. I mean, it was about a marine biologist who has a dolphin in the under study, and the dolphin could do miraculous things. We brought in the story a little, and also because it was probably 15 or 20 years, we made the plot lines a little more sophisticated. But it was the new adventures of Flipper, and that's what they were. They were the new adventures of the family favorite. So we didn't stray or bastardize the concept. And we didn't intentionally, because we knew the value of a negative. You could now make the 3rd new adventures of Flipper if you saw there was a market today. And we wanted to have that integrity of the basic concept be consistent throughout the years.
Okay. We'll stop here and we'll continue on the next tape.